Alright, we continue our discussion of the respiratory system. This is video part 3, looking at how oxygen is transported in the blood. So we know that it's important for oxygen to be delivered to the tissues after it comes in via the alveoli. So when we look at how oxygen is carried in the blood, most of it is bound to this protein called hemoglobin. So within our red blood cells is the hemoglobin molecule, which can bind 4 oxygen per hemoglobin, and that allows for efficient delivery of oxygen in the event we should not be breathing. For example, if a person is choking, or if they have a heart attack and there's a lack of blood supply to the heart muscle, the blood will unload oxygen from the hemoglobin molecules, giving us about 3 to 5 minutes before we're going to have oxygen-starved tissues. So it's a very efficient way of delivering oxygen to the tissues and having a little bit of a reservoir for oxygen. So therefore, 98.5% of all the oxygen in our body is transported bound to hemoglobin. The other 1.5% is simply free oxygen dissolved in the plasma. So when we look at carbon dioxide is a little different. Carbon dioxide enters our red blood cells after it diffuses out of the tissues into the interstitial fluid and then into the red blood cell, as we can see here in this diagram. And in the red blood cell, with the help of an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, it's converted to a bicarbonate ion. So bicarbonate ion is where we find carbon dioxide. So most of carbon dioxide is bound in the form of bicarbonate ions. And it's a reversible reaction. So when carbon dioxide is picked up in the tissues, it's converted to bicarbonate ion, and then back up in the lungs and the pulmonary capillaries, it's converted back to carbon dioxide so it can diffuse out of the blood and into the lungs, into the alveoli. So most of it is in the form of this bicarbonate ion after it's been converted to that inside the red blood cell. And then another 23% is also bound to hemoglobin, just like oxygen. So we do see carbon dioxide as bound to hemoglobin, just like oxygen, but a lot less of it. Most is in the form of that bicarbonate ion. And that bicarbonate ion plays a role in controlling blood pH. So we call it a buffer, which means it can take up excess hydrogen ion in order to raise our pH. So you'll learn more about that in advanced A&P. And then the other 7% of carbon dioxide in the blood is freely dissolved in the plasma. So it's in the liquid part of our blood. Just like we saw in oxygen, that 1.5% is freely dissolved in the blood. So a majority of it is transported as that bicarbonate ion. So when we look at what stimulates breathing on just a quiet, regular basis, that tidal flow of air going in and air going out with inhalation and exhalation, it's the medulla oblongata, that part of the brain stem, just like we saw with the heart, that controls the respiratory rate. So that's what stimulates the diaphragm and external intercostals via the phrenic nerve and the intercostal nerves to allow them to contract. And that again changes the volume, which changes the pressure and allows air to flow into the lungs. So the medulla is the primary part of the brain that controls the respiratory rate and controlling the respiratory muscles, and then the pons helps with the switching back and forth between inhalation and exhalation. So the two parts of the brainstem really do work together, the medulla and the pons, to set the rate for regular breathing. But it's the medulla that's primary for initiating that action potential to the phrenic nerve to serve the diaphragm, and the intercostal nerves to serve the external intercostals to move the ribs, again increasing the volume and allowing for inhalation. So when we look at the rhythmic ventilation, again it's the medulla that controls the breathing, and then the pons that sets the rhythm, switching from inhalation to exhalation. And recall that exhalation is just a passive process in which we merely inhibit the diaphragm and the external intercostals so they no longer contract. They relax and move upward and inward and decrease the volume of the chest cavity, causing air pressure to increase inside the alveoli, which then forces air out in exhalation. So when you look at what factors affect how fast we breathe. So we talk about modifying ventilation. There's certain factors within the blood that determine how fast a person is going to breathe. And we find that carbon dioxide, not oxygen, is the major regulator of breathing. Because if you think about it, because we have hemoglobin, which binds most of our oxygen, we can have a decrease in breathing, but oxygen levels won't change for 3 to 5 minutes as hemoglobin is unloading oxygen to the tissues. But carbon dioxide would build up very quickly if we weren't breathing or if we were choking. So when we see carbon dioxide build up in the tissues, that stimulates chemoreceptors, and that will increase the respiratory rate. So carbon dioxide, not oxygen, is the #1 regulator of our respiratory rate. So if carbon dioxide levels are high, we're going to see an increased respiratory rate. It's not till the oxygen levels get really low, like 50%, when we start to see oxygen increasing the respiratory rate. It's really that carbon dioxide. And we also know that we can modify our breathing using our thinking brain, which is the cerebrum, or the cerebral cortex. So if we want to increase our breathing, we can. Like if we're blowing up a balloon or, heaven forbid, taking a drag on a cigarette, we can control the ventilation. And the limbic system are our emotions. So if you're overly excited or scared or upset, sometimes we can just start an increase in breathing related to our emotions, which has nothing to do with oxygen or carbon dioxide, but it has to do with our emotions. So that's the limbic system. So here we can see a little diagram showing what things influence breathing and what things inhibit breathing. So here we can see our thinking brain can stimulate the respiratory center in the medulla to initiate breathing, or we can stop breathing if we want. That's what the negative sign is. Like, for example, when you hold your breath, that's a voluntary action that will inhibit breathing through the cerebral cortex. And there's chemoreceptors in the medulla that are looking for high carbon dioxide levels. Like we said, that's the #1 stimulator of breathing is high carbon dioxide. So as that increases, there's chemoreceptors that sense high carbon dioxide levels, which also leads to low pH, and that will stimulate the respiratory rate. We also find chemoreceptors in the carotid arteries running on either side of the neck and also in the aorta. And those are sensitive to low oxygen levels. So when oxygen levels get low, that's going to stimulate respiration. We have stretch receptors in the lungs. When the lungs are overly filled with air, they reflexively exhale, which prevents overinflation of the lungs. We call that the Herring-Brewer reflex. And that's how babies primarily breathe in the early months of life, is just by the natural exhale that occurs when the lungs are filled with air and those stretch receptors are stimulated. We also have proprioceptors, which are receptors for movement in the joints and muscles, that when the joints and muscles are moving, that stimulates respiration. Even though we don't necessarily need to breathe faster, it's just the movement that stimulates the breathing. And then we also have receptors for touch, temperature, and pain. If you've ever poked yourself or bumped your funny bone, you'll notice that you start to breathe a little faster as you're kind of coping with that pain. So those also will stimulate the respiratory rate. So we talked about the Herring-Brewer reflex. It prevents overinflation of the lungs. It inhibits breathing when the lungs are inflated. So when we have a little stretch of the alveoli, that is going to inhibit the medulla and it's going to cause exhalation. So again, it prevents overinflation in infants as well as adults when they're exercising and maybe they're maxed out with their exercise and really out of breath, that we don't want breathing to continue in an inhalation because that would cause overinflation. So when we look at exercise, we do see a slight increase in ventilation in early exercise, but it really has nothing to do with oxygen needs or a buildup of carbon dioxide. It's actually just those proprioceptors in the limbs. So when we're moving our arms and legs, again, that stimulates those proprioceptors to increase the respiratory rate. So going back to here, proprioceptors are just receptors for movement and body position. Those are stimulated when we move our arms and legs, but it has nothing to do with really needing more oxygen just yet. Because when we start to exercise, we do see a gradual increase in breathing, but again, it takes a little bit. And when we find exercise is increasing, we can see a little bit of lactic acid building up in the skeletal muscles, and that is going to drop the pH, which again can stimulate the respiratory rate. So as we age, what do we get to look forward to? Well, we find that we can't exchange as much air with the outside as we used to when we were younger. So vital capacity is going to go down, and how fast we can exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide with the outside air, that's going to go down. Our mucus tends to get dry and sticky, so we're less able to clear our airways. So just think of someone with a bad cold, or heaven forbid influenza. They're going to have a harder time clearing their airways, and they're more at risk for secondary infections like bronchitis or bacterial pneumonia, and they could more likely die from that. So the elderly really struggle when they get respiratory infections because of the inability to really cough well and to clear mucus from their airways. We find that the alveoli start to break down. There's less surface area for gas exchange, so they don't get oxygen as readily as a younger person, or they can't blow off carbon dioxide. So as a result, they're going to have a harder time with exercise, or even just walking across a parking lot if they're not in shape at all, because they just don't have the functional alveoli as a younger person would. Because of that leads to a larger residual volume and dead space, which are areas, the dead space is the area in the lungs where there is no gas exchange. So if we have less functional alveoli, that's going to increase that space where there is no gas exchange. So that is the end of the respiratory system, and our next topic will be the digestive system.